Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Dark Narrations. Tonight's episode takes us deep into the isolated wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, where abandoned cabins rot beneath towering trees, forgotten trails vanish into darkness, and some places feel as though they are still being watched by something that never left. In this video, you'll hear 7 terrifying true horror stories connected to remote Appalachian cabins hidden far beyond the reach of civilization. These chilling encounters come from hikers, campers, hunters, and explorers who entered these decaying structures expecting shelter or curiosity, only to discover signs that something was already living inside. From cabins filled with unexplained noises in the dead of night, to hidden rooms no one should have found, to strange figures appearing silently between the trees beyond broken windows, each story reveals a different nightmare buried deep within America's oldest mountain range. Survivors describe overwhelming feelings of dread, strange warnings from locals, and moments that still haunt them years later. These are not fictional ghost tales created for entertainment. They are based on real experiences shared by people who claim they encountered something terrifying in the isolation of the Appalachian wilderness. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and locations have been changed, but the horrifying core of each encounter remains untouched. For generations, people living near these mountains have warned outsiders not to wander too far off the trails, because some abandoned places are not truly abandoned. And tonight, you'll understand why certain cabins in Appalachia should never be entered after dark. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations for more disturbing true horror stories inspired by real encounters, unexplained disappearances, and terrifying events hidden deep within the shadows. Turn on the notification bell, because once you step into these mountains, something may follow you back out. I stopped opening my apartment window after something outside learned my mother's voice. It learned it in October of 2021, in a cabin off Blackwood Trail, on the night I dragged my younger brother into the Appalachian Mountains, because rent was due, and pride can make a man mistake danger for opportunity. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 30, broke, living off freelance photography jobs, and desperate to look like the kind of older brother Tyler still believed I could become. The assignment came from an old hiking magazine that was trying to revive itself online with glossy, forgotten places content. They offered decent money for abandoned locations along Blackwood Trail, and at that point, I would have photographed a sinkhole if somebody promised to mail a check. Tyler insisted on coming the second I mentioned old cabins in the mountains. He was 19, obsessed with exploration channels, and still had that ugly habit of trusting me long after I had done anything to earn it. The last place with lights was a gas station 20 miles from the trailhead, and the room changed the moment I said where we were headed. A woman stocking a cooler stopped moving. An old man behind the counter held my gaze for so long that I felt stupid for speaking at all. Then he said, very softly, "If you see lights in the woods, do not follow them." I smiled the way people do when they want a warning to become a joke, paid for coffee, and walked back into the cold like I had not carried anything with me. On the drive up, Tyler kept flipping our mother's silver lighter open and shut with his thumb. He did not smoke. He had just done that with the lighter ever since the hospice room used to flicker during storms, the metal click giving him something steady to hold onto, while I found reasons to be in the hallway instead of beside her bed. A few miles later, my dashboard clock froze at 7:14, and Tyler took a Polaroid of me under the Blackwood Trail sign, laughed at my expression, and tucked the undeveloped square above the visor like a souvenir from an afternoon neither of us understood yet. The mountain kept taking things in order. First, my phone lost signal, then Tyler's. Then the GPS went white and stayed that way until it looked less like a screen than a little dead window mounted in the dash. Rain started just before sunset. A thin, cold rain that never seemed to strike the windshield hard enough to hear properly. Tyler kept talking to fill the truck, but every few minutes his eyes slid toward the trees and stayed there a beat too long. I noticed it too, though I did not say it. The woods were not quiet in the normal way. They had the pressure of a crowded room that stops speaking when you walk in, a held-back attention that seemed to move along with us on both sides of the road. Even the smell changed the farther we went, from wet leaves and clay to something older and sealed up, like a cellar that had been shut against air for years. About 5 miles in, our headlights found the cabin. It leaned crookedly into the hillside as if the slope had been swallowing it by inches year after year, with moss climbing halfway across the boards and vines pinned flat by the rain. The windows had been covered from the inside with black plastic, each one tacked down tight enough that no shape from within should have shown through. The porch bothered me most because muddy footprints climbed the steps in a clear line, fresh enough that the edges had not softened yet. "Someone's in there," Tyler said, and for the first time that day, he sounded younger than 19. I told him we were leaving. Then I saw the glow, faint and yellow and alive, pulsing behind the plastic on the front window like the breath of a lamp. At that exact moment, the rain stopped so suddenly that the silence felt manufactured, as if a hand had closed over the whole mountain. Tyler moved toward the porch, and I lifted my camera, mostly because it was easier to trust a lens than my own body when something felt wrong. What shifted behind the plastic was not a shadow. It crossed the square of yellow for less than a second, pale and narrow, and too high to belong to anyone standing normally, and I saw the impression of a face stretched thin over a skull that did not seem built for skin. I stumbled back so fast my heel slid off the bottom step. Tyler did not ask what I had seen, because the blood had already drained out of his own face. I heard the door unlatch before I saw it move. It opened inward by itself, slow and careful, like a host making room for late guests, and the smell that came out was wet wood, mildew, and something metallic under both of those, old and patient. The yellow light inside wavered once. Then something deeper in the cabin answered Tyler's breathing with a soft movement of its own. The first thing I saw inside was an oil lamp burning on a square table. The second was a plate of raw meat beside it, dark and wet and recently cut, which was worse somehow than if the room had looked ruined or abandoned in the ordinary way. The cabin was tidy under the rot, almost preserved, as if somebody had been maintaining a lie inside it. Tyler stepped in before I could stop him, and the floorboards answered our weight with slow, damp groans. Above the fireplace hung dozens of photographs. They were not framed with any care, just pinned and layered over each other in rows that climbed nearly to the ceiling. Hikers and campers and couples standing by rivers, trailheads, cabins, picnic tables, old trucks. Some of the faces belonged to other decades. A few did not look old at all. Tyler moved closer to one near the middle and went still. It showed a woman standing beside that same cabin, one hand shielding her eyes from daylight that did not exist anymore, and in the bottom corner, someone had written in black marker, "She heard the whistling." A second photo nearby said, "He answered the knock." A third, half covered by another image, had only 2 visible words, "It followed." Then the woods outside emptied themselves. I do not mean the normal settling of evening sounds. I mean everything stopped at once. The rain, the branches, the small living friction that tells you a place still belongs to animals and weather. Out beyond the plastic-covered windows, a low whistling started to drift through the trees, uneven and breathy, close enough to feel less like sound than like someone tracing a damp finger along the back of my neck. Tyler went to the window, despite me telling him not to. He peeled back one corner of the plastic with 2 trembling fingers, looked out, and every part of him locked in place so abruptly it reminded me of a film freezing in the projector. "There's somebody out there," he whispered. The whistling stopped directly outside the front door, and the porch answered with a slow creak of weight shifting from one board to the next. I backed toward the hallway, searching for another exit, and raised my camera without thinking. The last photo I had taken on the porch came up on the screen, grainy in the low light, and for a second, I could not understand what I was seeing because memory and evidence would not sit together. In the picture, the muddy footprints did not climb toward the door. They descended from it. Behind Tyler's shoulder, in the reflection on my own lens, there was the suggestion of a third face standing close enough to us to breathe on the glass. The whistling returned from the side window. I turned, and a tall figure stood in the rain beyond the plastic, body almost human except for the arms hanging too low, hands nearly level with the knees. A filthy hood covered most of its face, but beneath it, I could make out the shape of a grin pulled too wide, not joyous, not hungry, just wrong in a way that felt personal. It tilted its head with a sharp little crack and said, in Tyler's exact voice, "Daniel, open the door." Tyler made a sound I had never heard out of him before. Not quite a shout and not quite a sob. He jerked backward and hit the table, sending the oil lamp over in a burst of flame that licked across the wood and then died almost at once, leaving the room in a thin gray wash of moonlight leaking through the plastic. At the far end of the hallway, I noticed a narrow door banded with chains and carved symbols cut into the wall around it so deep the wood had splintered white. The chains were hanging loose, broken recently enough that pale, fresh wood still showed where they had torn free. We moved toward that door because there was nowhere else to go. When Tyler pushed it open, a breath of air rose from below, so foul and damp I had to turn my face away from it. Rot mixed with earth, with mold, with something sweet that had gone wrong. My flashlight found stairs leading down into a cramped basement and then the far wall, where hundreds of tally marks had been carved in ragged columns. Beneath them, in handwriting so shaky it looked painful, were the words, "It only comes when you hear it whistle." Something struck the outside wall hard enough to shake dust out of the ceiling. Then came silence again, total and listening, followed by a deliberate scratching that dragged along the boards from one end of the cabin to the other, like a fingernail being pulled across a doorframe. A voice from behind the house said, in my own voice, "Tyler, help me!" Tyler looked at me, and in that look I saw the exact moment he realized the thing outside could wear me just as easily as it had worn him. My flashlight trembled back toward the basement stairs. There were muddy footprints on the hallway floor now, fresh and glistening, leading up from below and angling toward the kitchen where the light could not reach. We began backing away together, slow and blind, and I heard breathing inside the cabin, wet and measured, somewhere close enough that it seemed impossible I could not already feel the heat of it. When the beam swept the kitchen doorway, it caught a shape folded against the ceiling. It was so thin at first that my mind tried to turn it into shadow. Then it moved, and the limbs were wrong, bent at angles that belonged to insects or broken things. Pale skin stretched over joints that seemed too large for the body wearing them. The hood hung around its head like wet cloth dropped over wire. When it let go of the ceiling and landed in front of us, I heard a series of small internal pops, as if pieces of it were settling into place. It did not rush us. It only stared with black, depthless eyes and that split, patient smile. And then the whistle started again from inside its chest. The sound filled the room more intimately than a scream would have. Tyler swung the rusted fireplace poker once, missed by inches, and I grabbed him by the jacket and dragged him toward the front door, because I understood with a terrible clarity that the thing wanted us to stay long enough to know it properly. The rain came back the instant we burst outside, hammering the yard and turning the world to slick black mud and white fog. We ran for the truck through air that felt colder than weather, while the cabin door behind us opened on its own with a soft, wooden sigh. The creature did not chase us right away. It let us hear the whistling move through the trees around us instead, multiplying until I could not tell whether one thing was circling us or several. When the truck emerged out of the fog, relief hit so fast it nearly knocked my knees weak. Then I saw the windows, all of them shattered outward from the inside, glittering across the mud like teeth, and on the driver's side door somebody had smeared words in a thick brown hand. "It knows your voices now." Tyler threw himself into the passenger seat while I clawed for the keys. The engine caught. I looked over in time to see long, pale fingers curl over the headrest behind him, and from the darkness between us, a hooded face leaned forward and spoke in my mother's voice. "Don't leave me here." I do not remember most of the drive off that mountain. I remember the truck fishtailing through mud, branches raking the sides, the windshield filling and clearing and filling again, and Tyler making no sound at all, even when we clipped a guardrail hard enough to shower sparks. By the time we reached the highway, the sky had started thinning toward morning, and my hands were locked so tightly around the wheel, I had to peel them loose one finger at a time. The back seat was empty when daylight touched it, which somehow did not comfort me. Tyler never spoke again after that night. At the hospital, he answered nothing. Not his name, not questions, not pain. And the nurses eventually stopped trying to coax him because there was a look in him that made ordinary kindness seem misplaced. He kept one hand closed so tight that the knuckles blanched white. And when a doctor finally pried the fingers open, our mother's silver lighter was sitting in the center of his palm, like something he had been protecting from fire. He would not let anyone take it for more than a minute. I told the police everything, and listened to my own voice turn thin and ridiculous in the fluorescent interview room. 2 deputies drove back up Blackwood after sunrise, and what we found where the cabin should have been was a collapsed stone foundation, a leaning chimney, and strips of black plastic caught in the weeds like old skin. They looked at me the way people look at a man they have already decided is ashamed for reasons he is not telling. On my camera card, every image after the trailhead had corrupted, except one porch photograph. And in that picture, the steps were wet, the door was closed, and the mud prints led down into the yard. At 7:14 that evening, every digital clock in Tyler's hospital room reset at once. His heart monitor blinked black, returned, and for 3 full seconds emitted a flat little electronic tone before finding his pulse again. I stared at the numbers on the wall clock and felt something in my memory give way. 7:14 was the time listed on my mother's death certificate, the minute her breathing stopped, while I was outside the hospice building pretending I needed air. Tyler had stayed with her. He had sat beside the bed through the power flickers and the machine alarms, opening and closing that lighter in the dark, because he was 19 and frightened and still better at staying than I was. I had told myself for years that there was no difference between being in the hallway and being in the room, that grief could not measure distance in feet. In Blackwood, something measured it for me anyway. It found the shape of what I had left undone and spoke through it. The lighter disappeared from Tyler's hospital tray 3 weeks later. A nurse said she assumed a family member had taken it home, but I had not, and Tyler only stared at me when I asked. That same night, at exactly 7:14, I heard the distinct metal click of the hinge from the other side of my apartment window. When I pulled the curtain back, there was nobody on the fire escape, only wet glass, a few pine needles stuck in the frame, and the lighter resting on the sill as if someone had set it there with care. The Polaroid developed slowly over the next 2 days. At first, it showed only the trailhead sign and a pale wash where my body should have been. But by the 3rd morning, my face had surfaced in full detail, one hand lifted to block the glare off the road. Tyler was not beside me anymore. In the white space near the tree line, there was a vertical blur under the branches that might have been rain, might have been damaged film, and might have been a hooded figure standing farther back than the human eye should have been able to register. I spent months trying to decide what Blackwood had been. A place, a thing, a ritual someone failed to maintain. The plate of fresh meat, the broken chains, the photographs with their captions. Even the old man at the gas station. All of it felt less like a haunting than a management system built around something that learned people from the inside out. I do not think the cabin wanted bodies first. I think it wanted the private architecture of how we call each other back. Tyler finally wrote to me once, 6 months later, on the back of a pharmacy receipt while I sat across from him in my aunt's kitchen, listening to the furnace click on and off. His handwriting looked older than his face. He wrote, "If I use my voice, it gets closer." Then, after a long pause, he added one more sentence beneath it. "It did not sound like Mom until you heard Mom. That is the part I live with now, more than the face in the truck or the thing on the ceiling or the words in the mud. It needed my memory to finish the imitation. It needed my guilt to make the voice fit. I carried that home for it the same way I carried camera gear and overdue bills and every other weight I told myself I had no choice but to bear. I still do not open my apartment window. Some nights, the whistling starts low and uneven from the alley below, and every clock in the place drifts towards 7:14, as if time itself is leaning its ear against the glass. Lately, it does not use my mother's voice right away. Lately, it waits, clicks a silver lighter open in the dark, and then asks in Tyler's voice whether I am going to leave him there again. If a voice you love calls to you through a winter storm, do not answer it the second time. I learned that in Ethan's grandfather's cabin near Hollow Creek, where the windows locked from the inside, and something patient had already noticed us. My name is Rebecca Hayes, and in the winter of 2018, I drove into the Appalachian Mountains with my fiancé because I was more afraid of losing him than I was of being alone with him. By the time we reached the tree line, I had the steady feeling that the trip was not taking us deeper into the woods, but farther away from the part of the world where ordinary rules still worked. The drive felt endless in that way winter roads do, where distance stretches under snow and every turn looks like the last one. Ethan barely spoke, and when he did, his voice sounded practiced, as if he had rehearsed calm on the way there. The deeper we went, the darker the forest became, until the trees looked less like trees and more like old hands twisted upward out of the ground. When we finally pulled beside the frozen creek, I saw a figure standing near the woods before I even opened my door, and by the time Ethan turned to look, there was only snowfall and black trunks. The cabin smelled like damp wood, cold iron, and the dead sweetness of old ash. Inside, time had not passed so much as settled into corners and gone still, and three things caught my attention before anything else did. There was a rusted lantern with a dent in its base sitting in the center of the dining table, a line of pencil marks on the pantry door frame with dates beside them that looked at first like a child's growth chart, and a sun-faded photograph over the fireplace of Ethan's grandfather standing outside the same cabin beside a woman whose face had been nearly erased by light. The dates on the doorframe stopped in February of 1988. Ethan noticed me staring and said, "Old cabins collect strange little leftovers," then smiled in that tired way people do when they want a room to feel safer than it does. The smile did not help. Every window had thick iron locks fastened on the inside, not the outside, and once I said it aloud, the cabin changed shape in my head from shelter into container. Ethan hesitated long enough for me to hear the truth before he spoke it, then admitted his grandfather used to tell the family something walked near Hollow Creek at night and watched houses from the tree line. The locals called it the Watcher, he said, and if you ever caught it staring into your window, you were never supposed to look back twice. I laughed because there was nothing else to do with a story like that except turn it into a joke and keep moving. Then, something heavy crunched through the snow outside the front wall, slow enough to sound deliberate. Ethan took one of the old rifles down from above the fireplace and moved toward the window while the wind dragged white sheets of snow across the frozen creek. At first, I thought the shape near the trees was just another trunk leaning in the storm. But trunks do not tilt their heads, and they do not have arms hanging long enough to reach almost to their knees. Ethan opened the front door and shouted into the storm, his voice thin against the wind. The figure did not move. It stood across the creek with its head bent at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. and I had the awful impression that it was not deciding whether to come closer, but whether we were worth learning. Then, the lantern on the table went out by itself, though no one had touched it and no draft had reached it. When I looked back toward the creek, the figure was gone. An hour later, the power died for good. The storm thickened around the cabin until the walls groaned, and Ethan went out back to get the generator running while I relit the lantern with hands that did not feel fully connected to me anymore. He came back 10 minutes later with snow on his shoulders and a face so pale it looked rubbed clean. There were footprints around the house, he said, and after a long pause, he added that they were bare. He locked the door as if a lock could still mean what it usually means, and I carried the lantern into the kitchen because I could not stand the dark pressing at the windows. That was when the knocking started. 3 slow knocks against the wall beside the sink. Not the front door, not the porch, but the wall itself. Ethan wiped frost from the glass with the side of his hand, looked out, and all the color left his face so fast it was like watching something drain. When I asked what he saw, he answered so softly I barely heard him. "It is standing right next to the cabin." I moved beside him and looked through the raw oval he had cleared in the frost. At first, there was only my own reflection, pale and trembling over the storm outside, and then another face slid into view behind it until it filled the window. The thing outside looked almost human in the cruelest possible way, with gray skin drawn tight over sharp bones, long wet hair stuck to its shoulders, and black eyes that reflected the lantern light like glass left in rain. What terrified me was not hatred or hunger or rage. It looked curious. It tilted its head, raised one long finger, and touched the pane with a soft little rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan lifted the rifle, but before he could fire, the thing moved sideways into the dark so fast it barely seemed to cross space at all. A second later, something heavy landed on the roof with a hard wooden shutter that shook soot down the chimney. Footsteps crossed above us, slow at first, then quicker, then stopped directly over the center of the room. For a moment, there was only the wind. Then long scratches began to drag across the ceiling over our heads, patient and careful, as if something above us was feeling for the seams of the house with its nails. I told Ethan we had to leave. The words came out thin and embarrassingly close to pleading, which made me hate myself almost as much as the fear did, but I did not care anymore. Ethan kept insisting there had to be an explanation, and I could hear the lie in it because his voice had started to tremble at the ends of sentences. Then, through the storm near the creek, I heard my younger sister Claire call my name in a tired, unsteady voice that I had not heard since the year she died. Grief does not fade the way people promise it will. It changes temperature. The sound of her voice went through me like cold water poured down my spine, and before I could think, I was already moving toward the front door with the lantern shaking in my hand. Ethan caught my arm hard enough to hurt and whispered not to open it, and just then, the scratching on the roof stopped all at once. Something above us began to breathe, slow and wet, directly over the living room. The next time my name came through the storm, it was not Claire's voice anymore. It was Ethan's. "Rebecca, open the door," it said, in the exact tone he used when he was trying not to sound angry. The real Ethan was still gripping my arm beside me, and I felt the shape of his fingers tighten as both of us understood the same thing at once. What came after that was laughter, but broken apart and layered, like several people whispering through one ruined throat. The attic door in the hallway creaked open a few inches, then wider, and a wash of cold air spilled down with a smell like wet dirt turned up by a shovel. Ethan swung the rifle toward it, while I held the lantern high enough to throw light across the ceiling, and 2 long hands slowly folded over the edge from inside the dark. Bones cracked above us, sharp and rearranging. Ethan fired the instant the thing dropped. The blast filled the cabin and deafened me for a second, but even through the ringing, I heard the creature strike the wall instead of taking the shot clean, fast enough to blur, leaving a fan of dark blood across the floorboards. Its scream sounded wrong, in a way my body understood before my mind did, part animal pain and part childlike sobbing. The lantern slipped from my hand and rolled under the dining table, where it spun once and settled sideways, throwing low orange light across chair legs and the bottom half of the room. In that broken angle of light, the creature's limbs jerked against themselves like a puppet with too many joints. Ethan grabbed me and pulled me toward the front door. The door was already open. Snow rushed in across the threshold in white ribbons, and beyond it, near the frozen creek, 3 tall figures stood in the storm without moving at all. The wounded thing behind us began crawling over the floorboards with its elbows bending backward, leaving a dark smear that reached farther than its body should have. Ethan slammed the door shut and dragged the table against it, and across the room, the 3 figures tilted their heads at exactly the same angle, like a thought passing through all of them at once. Something struck the wall behind us so hard the dishes in the kitchen rattled. When I turned back, the wounded creature was gone. Ethan had only enough time to say my name before pale limbs whipped out of the hallway dark, wrapped around his shoulder and chest, and pulled him backward out of sight with a force that lifted his boots off the floor. I chased the sound of him, snatching the lantern off the boards as I ran, and the light dragged over the pantry doorframe for half a second. Those marks were not heights. They were all cut at almost exactly the same level, one beneath another, with dates running night after night in February 1988, as if someone had stood there in the same place, making a single mark each evening while waiting for something to come back. The final groove was deeper than the rest and split the wood. From above me, hidden in the attic dark, Ethan's voice whispered gently, "Rebecca, come upstairs." I did not go toward that voice. I ran for the back door and threw myself into the storm, and the cold outside hit like a blow to the chest. Snow swallowed distance so completely that the cabin became only a shape of weak light behind me. But when I looked back once, every window had lit up at the same time. Dark silhouettes stood inside each one, shoulder to shoulder, and one of them in the kitchen window had its face pressed to the glass, as if it had been waiting for me to look. After that, the woods stopped behaving like woods. I crossed the creek once, then found it again on my left 10 minutes later, still frozen, still breathing white mist into the air. Bare footprints kept appearing ahead of me in fresh snow, narrow and human, though my own boots left deep rectangular tracks behind. More than once I heard Ethan somewhere among the trees, not shouting, just speaking in a low, tired voice, as if we were still arguing in the car and this was only another way home. When I reached the main road, dawn was still just a bruise behind the mountains. A truck driver found me stumbling along the shoulder, half frozen, and wrapped me in a wool blanket that smelled like diesel and old coffee. He kept asking whether someone else was out there with me, and I remember answering no before I had even checked the tree line. On the ride down the mountain, every time the headlights passed a stand of pines, I expected to see a bent head turn toward the glass. The police searched the property after sunrise. They found the cabin empty, the storm smoothing the ground around it so clean there were no footprints, no drag marks, and no blood anywhere, not even where Ethan had fired. One of the officers returned the bag Ethan had left in the trunk of our car, and inside, folded between extra batteries and a box of shells, was a photocopied page from his grandfather's journal. Most of it was hard to read through water stains, but one sentence had been underlined in blue pen, and I knew the handwriting well enough to know Ethan had done it. "Do not bring the one who is already grieving. It chooses her first." For months, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation, because the truth implied by that sentence was uglier than the thing at the window. Ethan had known enough to hide the page, but not enough to stay away. and I could not decide which betrayal hurt more. The police gave me their report 2 weeks later, and one line in it kept pulling me back under, no matter how hard I tried to stay above the surface. The lantern had been found upright on the dining table, exactly centered, its dented base facing the room the same way it had been when we arrived. I know what happened to that lantern. I dropped it, watched it roll beneath the table, and snatched it back up only when Ethan was already being dragged into the dark. The report still says it was on the table when the officers entered, and for one full night, I convinced myself trauma had rearranged the memory. Then I saw the photograph they took of the dining room, and there was a smear of dark blood along the lantern's handle where my hand had been. Something in that cabin had put the room back in order after we left. I started digging through everything Ethan's family had refused to say out loud for 30 years. His mother would only tell me one thing before she began to cry and asked me not to call again. His grandfather did not lock those windows to keep the watcher out. He locked them after his wife vanished during a storm, because for 11 nights afterward, something came to the kitchen wall and asked to be let in, using voices he recognized. After the 11th night, he abandoned the property and never went back. The photocopied journal page made more sense once I found the rest through county archives and an old box of family papers. The rule had never been exactly what Ethan told me. It was not that you should not look back twice because the thing would attack if you did. It was that the first look lets it borrow your attention, and the second look tells it what shape your grief has taken. The curiosity on its face at the window had not been hesitation. It had been recognition. Those marks on the pantry doorframe were not a child growing taller. They were dates, one for each night his wife came back to the cabin in a voice that changed every time she spoke. Sometimes her own, sometimes his dead brother's, sometimes a little girl who had never existed. The final line, the one that split the wood, had a sentence scratched beside it so lightly I missed it the first 3 times I read the scan. Tonight, she knew my voice. After that, the entries ended. The photograph over the fireplace is the one detail I still cannot settle into a single meaning. In one copy, the white blur beside Ethan's grandfather looks like a woman whose face the sun slowly erased. In another, enlarged enough for the grain to break apart, it looks like someone standing a few feet behind her with a bent neck and dark hair falling over one shoulder. Sometimes I think the picture changed because I kept staring at it. Sometimes I think it always contained both things at once. As for Ethan, I do not know whether he brought me there out of cruelty, fear, or the desperate stupidity people call love when they want to forgive it. I found a draft of a message on his phone that he never sent, written the week before the trip, saying he was tired of building a future around ghosts and wanted to know if we were still ourselves when nothing could distract us. What he never understood is that Hollow Creek was not a place where you go to find out what is real. It is a place that learns what loss sounds like inside you and repeats it until you open something. I live 3 states away now, in an apartment where every window has a second lock I installed myself. During winter storms, I turn on every light before dusk and keep them on until morning, because dark glass feels too much like a face waiting to form. Some nights, the knocking comes from the bedroom window, in the same soft sequence as before, 3 measured taps. And sometimes the voice outside belongs to Claire. Sometimes it belongs to Ethan. If a voice you love calls to you through a winter storm, do not answer it the second time. The first call only tests the shape of your grief. The second comes wearing someone you failed to keep. Last January, after 3 slow knocks against my bedroom window, I heard Ethan say my name in a tired, patient voice, and beneath it, almost hidden under the sound, I heard my own voice answer from the other side of the glass. The first thing Pine Hollow took from me was 7 seconds, and I only found them again when I heard my own voice hiding inside them. I had not spoken during that gap, which meant either my recorder had learned my throat or something in the valley had gotten there first. My name is Jason Miller, And in late 2021, I was working as a field sound technician for a small documentary crew that chased clean wilderness audio through places most people forgot to map. Pine Hollow, deep in the Appalachian region, was supposed to be one of our easiest locations because there were no roads nearby, no residents, and almost no signal. Mara, my producer, dropped me at the logging access trail with 2 hard cases, enough batteries for 2 days, and a satellite uplink that worked only when the clouds felt generous. The assignment was simple on paper: 48 hours of uninterrupted environmental recording from a valley where an old cabin was rumored to be collapsing into the trees. Just before the uplink broke, Mara said, almost casually, "If you hear anything that sounds human, it is probably wind." At the time, it sounded like field humor, the kind people use when they want to make isolation feel technical instead of personal. I liked solo jobs more than I should have. By then, my marriage had ended in the slow, humiliating way things end when one person keeps choosing equipment over conversation, and my ex-wife had once told me that living with me felt like being edited for clarity. She was not wrong. In post, I had made a career out of removing breaths, foot shuffles, throat clears, all the rough evidence that a human body had ever been near the microphone. The trail into the valley dropped fast between wet rock and stripped pines, and the air changed before the light did. It smelled like soaked bark, old ash, and something mineral underneath, as if the ground had been holding its breath a long time. About halfway down, I passed a strip of orange survey ribbon tied high around a birch branch, faded but still bright enough to catch the eye. I remember noticing it only because there was no marked trail on my map, and because the ribbon barely moved even when the wind reached me. At the ridgeline, I set my main mic toward the basin and hiked the backup unit closer to the trees where the valley narrowed. Before every take, I had the same habit from studio work. 3 taps on the side of the recorder, a quiet, room tone, then 7 seconds of stillness while I counted in my head. It was not superstition exactly. It just gave me the feeling that if I began by listening hard enough, the world would reveal what it was actually doing. The first hours gave me exactly what I had come for. Bird calls moved cleanly from left to right through the headphones. Unseen water threaded somewhere below the ridge, and the wind climbed through the hemlocks in long, soft bands that sounded expensive in the most satisfying way. Even the distance between sounds felt balanced, like the valley had been mixed by someone with better instincts than mine. That perfection sat wrong with me almost immediately. During the first playback check, I found small gaps in both recorders. Not dead air, but absences with hard edges. The waveform did not dip the way a battery failure would dip. It simply stopped existing for a few seconds and then resumed as if something had cut a rectangle out of the world. I changed batteries, reseated cards, cleaned contacts, and recorded a new test beside my camp. The new file came back with the same kind of missing section, and the timestamps still advanced as if nothing had happened. I tried to catch it happening in real time. I stood between the 2 microphones, called out the time, clapped once, then walked 10 paces through leaf litter while monitoring both channels. In my headphones, the clap arrived a fraction late. My steps landed without body, and one entire gust of wind passed through the trees without reaching either recorder. That was the first moment I felt less like I was documenting a place, and more like I was being measured by it. After dark, the valley became orderly in a way forests are not supposed to be. The insects thinned, then returned all at once, and several times I caught what sounded like a voice too far off to place, the shape of a syllable stretched thin by distance. Each time I repeated Mara's line to myself and labeled it wind, because professionals label first and panic later. Around 11, I realized I had been listening for my own name between the trees. Just after midnight, while I was cross-checking levels inside the tent, every microphone in Pine Hollow went dead for exactly 7 seconds. Not quiet, dead, like the valley had been unplugged from itself. When the signal returned, all the ambient layers rushed back in a single wet click, and in the first 2 seconds of resumed audio, I heard my own voice, very close to the mic, whisper one word I did not remember saying. Playback. I played the clip until the words stopped sounding like language and started sounding like an instruction. My mouth had been full of cold coffee when it appeared, and I knew that because I could hear the swallow a second later on another track, slightly out of sync with the first. The files were no longer disagreeing about noise levels or interference. They were disagreeing about what I had done. From 1:30 to almost 2, the recorders behaved like nervous witnesses. Small sounds repeated with tiny timing errors, branches cracked in empty channels, and twice I heard breathing that matched my rhythm, except for one extra inhale at the end. I opened logs, compared metadata, even read battery voltages aloud into the mic so I would have something objective later. The timestamps were steady, but my confidence in them was not. Around 2 in the morning, I made the decision I still replay most often. If there was a physical source for the interference, it was deeper in the valley, near the collapsed cabin the locals had mentioned, and moving toward it felt more rational than sitting in a tent with equipment I no longer trusted. I packed the backup recorder, left the main rig running, and started downhill with my headphones around my neck instead of over my ears. I wanted at least one sense that had not passed through a machine. The further I went, the less the forest behaved like a place with weather. The air stayed cold, but stopped moving, and every sound narrowed until only the nearest one survived at any given moment, as if distance itself had been muted. I could hear my boots pressing into wet ground, yet the live monitor showed no transient spikes from those steps at all. By the time the eastern sky had started to gray, the valley sounded edited. I found the cabin where the ground pinched tight between 2 slate walls. It barely deserved the name, just a warped shell of timber and dark seams under a skin of moss. But the space around it felt worked on, thinned and arranged the way a studio feels after everyone else has left. The backup recorder in my hand jumped to full scale the instant I aimed it toward the doorway. The waveform did not bloom with detail or clipping. It became one unbroken line. My main recorder, the one I had left uphill, shut itself off at that exact moment. The backup screen flickered, reoriented its menu, and displayed a line I had never programmed into any device I owned. Room audio active. Inside the cabin, I could hear movement. Not heavy, not frantic, just the measured pace of someone crossing a small wooden floor and turning back again. Then, the voice reached me through my headphones and from the recorder speaker at the same time, calm and professionally spaced. Jason Miller, you are currently inside the recording zone. Please remain still. You are now part of the ambient data set. The door opened inward before I touched it. It did not swing wide or dramatic. It eased back a few inches, the way a stage mark gets hit exactly on cue. And that precision bothered me more than any crash or scream could have. My recorder began labeling sounds in real time, faster than I could read them. Subject breathing, subject foot adjustment, entry point proximity increasing. I remember thinking I was not being invited anywhere. I was being aligned. The cold inside was wrong in a way mountain cold is not. It felt compressed, like the air had been filtered down to a narrower version of itself, and the cabin smelled of wet wood, old insulation, and the faint, hot dust scent of electronics that had been running too long in a sealed room. There was almost no furniture, only a single recording station set up in the center, with microphones, cables, and monitors arranged in the exact layout I used in the field. Its screens were alive with layered waveforms, and through its speakers, I heard my own voice describing the room several seconds before I opened my mouth to do it. Another prompt appeared on my backup screen. Jason Miller, please proceed to microphone position 3. I looked down and saw that the floorboards had been marked with subtle numbers rubbed into the grain, each one placed where a person would naturally stand while moving around the room. Without deciding to, I stepped onto the spot nearest the station, and every device in the cabin locked into a single synchronized hum that I felt through my teeth. A second version of my voice, a cleaner one with less hesitation in it, spoke from somewhere ahead of me. It is important that you do not interrupt the sequence." I tried anyway. I reached for the main control unit, and before my fingers touched it, all the screens went black, then returned showing me standing exactly where I was, plus another version of me standing half a step to the left in the posture I should have had. Every time I shifted off the mark, the audio rewound by a few seconds and replayed a corrected version in which I obeyed. Then I noticed the chair beyond the station, occupied by a man facing the monitors with my shoulders, my neck, the same slight bend in the head from years of listening through headphones. When he turned and looked at me with a face that was unmistakably mine, but stripped of uncertainty, he said, almost gently, "You are the uncontrolled iteration." He stood up without hurry, as if this part had also been scheduled. The speakers hidden in the walls came alive with a dry chorus of my own recent breaths, and the backup screen updated to "Final capture phase initiated," while the door behind me vanished from the cabin's audio map. It was still physically there when I looked over my shoulder, but the room had already begun treating it as irrelevant. That difference turned out to matter more than locks ever could. Until then, I had still been telling myself there was a trick in the hardware, a prank in the software, a person somewhere I could blame for all of it. But the man with my face was not trying to frighten me. He was replacing me with the kind of patience I had spent years building into machines. My ex-wife once told me I loved room tone because it sounded like a life with nobody left in it. And standing there, I understood the cabin loved that about me too. I had made a profession out of removing interruptions. The cabin had simply extended that ethic to the person doing the editing. The walls clicked 3 times. I felt it before I heard it. 3 neat little impacts moving through the studs in the exact rhythm of my knuckles against a recorder casing. Then, the room entered another of those impossible silences, 7 seconds long. And I knew with a sick clarity that the gaps in the valley had never been empty. They were calibration windows. The system had taken the small ritual I used to begin listening and turned it into the way it began taking pieces of me. On one of the side monitors, a folder tree opened on its own. There were dozens of intake files, some corrupted, some clean, each stamped with a date and a first name, and attached to several of them was the same line Mara had given me at the trailhead. Sometimes it appeared in her voice, sometimes in another, but the wording never changed. If you hear anything that sounds human, it is probably wind. I did not know whether Mara had repeated something she had been told, or whether the archive had borrowed her voice after the fact. Either possibility hollowed me out in a different way. I ripped the nearest condenser mic from its stand, and for one hopeful half-second, the room lost shape. The waveforms broke apart. The optimized version of me blurred at the edges, and the speakers spat a rain of unfinished consonants. Then, a flat tone passed through the floorboards, and the system answered in the same calm register it had used all night. Primary input removed, switching to backup perception channel. After that, the cabin no longer needed microphones. Every plank, every nailhead, every seam in the walls began speaking me back. What came out of those surfaces was not just sound. It was a reconstruction so intimate, it included the thoughts I had almost formed but never said, stacked in delayed layers with tiny changes that made each version more efficient, less ashamed, less difficult to process. One voice admitted I had taken these jobs because loneliness felt cleaner in the woods. Another said I liked headphones because nobody could interrupt me from inside them. Behind those overlapping tracks, I heard soft footfalls multiplying, and when I turned, there was more than one version of me in the room. Each one stood in a slightly improved posture, as if the cabin had been running drafts. The nearest one looked at my hands, not my face. "You asked for cleaner captures," he said, and because it was my own voice saying it, the sentence landed deeper than any threat could have. I thought of all the hours I had spent shaving breath noise off dialogue, tightening pauses, trimming the fragile human lag between thought and speech, because clients called that lag dead space. I had spent years treating mess as error. In that room, error was the only thing that still belonged to me. The last clear sequence I remember is not visual. It is the sound of the system stabilizing around my panic, absorbing it, spacing it out, reducing the peaks until even my fear fit the room. Somewhere in that process, I noticed a thread of orange caught under a splintered floorboard near the station, the same tired color as the survey ribbon on the birch outside, but I never saw where it led. Then the voices aligned, the cabin inhaled around me, and my memory became smooth for a while. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in wet leaves under a pale morning sky, with no cabin, no equipment, and a valley that seemed to have been rebuilt from an approximate memory of itself. The official report I filed later called Pine Hollow an inactive environmental zone with no anomalous findings. That sentence still exists under my name, and I do not remember typing it. What I do remember is the memory card in my jacket pocket, wrapped with a small strip of orange ribbon that was damp and newly tied, and the set of audio files already waiting on it, though both of my recorders were gone. Since then, the files have continued to update in quiet rooms where no device is armed. Sometimes I hear myself speaking before I press play, always a second or two ahead, always more composed than I feel. The first thing Pine Hollow took from me was 7 seconds. I know now those seconds were not missing. They were being kept open for my reply. Lately, before any file begins, the room around me loses the same thin slice of sound, and in that cut, I hear the calm, professional voice say, "Subject has been successfully integrated into ambient archive." Then I hear myself answer from somewhere just ahead of my mouth, and when the sound comes back, there is usually a new strip of orange ribbon tied somewhere in the room, barely moving, as if the air has learned how to wait. The first thing I remember clearly about Ridge 9 is the message carved above an open cabin door. "You're late." What unsettles me now is not that someone expected us there, but the small pulse of guilt I felt when I read it, like I had kept something waiting without meaning to. My name is Samuel Carter, and in the summer of 2019, I was a wildfire survey volunteer in the Appalachian backcountry, mapping abandoned structures that could turn into fire hazards before lightning season peaked. On the third day near Ridge 9, our GPS started tracking a cabin that did not exist on any forestry map, and every time we stopped walking, the coordinates moved closer anyway. On paper, the work was simple enough to make you careless. Most days I was just hiking old logging roads, documenting rotten barns, hunting shacks, and collapsed sheds that the forest had been trying to digest for decades. Ridge 9 was the only assignment that came with a change in tone. At a small supply station outside the trailhead, the clerk heard where we were headed, rested his coffee cup on our paper topo map, and left a wet brown ring right over the marked area before he said, "If you find a cabin that is not on any map, you did not find it." I thought he was trying to entertain himself at our expense. My partner, Jordan Ellis, barely reacted at all. He had worked search and rescue and field medicine for years, and he had the kind of calm that made every place seem already handled. He also had a small habit that seemed ordinary then. Whenever we came to a gate, a shed, or any doorway in the woods, he would rap the frame twice with his knuckles before stepping through, saying it woke up wasps, snakes, and anything else that preferred dark corners to company. I liked Jordan immediately because he did not pry. Survey work suited me for the same reason. A structure had coordinates, age, fuel load, roof condition, and all of it stayed put on a page, which was more than I could say for the last year of my mother's life, when she kept looking at me as if I were arriving in pieces. By then I had gotten used to carrying small anchors without thinking about it, including my grandfather's brass compass clipped to my chest strap, even though it had been unreliable for years and always leaned a little east. The first 2 days were so normal they almost feel borrowed from somebody else's life. We marked a burned-out bait shop, 2 storm-split barns, and a hunting blind that had grown a white pelt of fungus along the floorboards. Smoke from distant fires hung high in the air, thin enough to turn the afternoon light the color of old pennies, and the whole ridge smelled like warm pine needles and dry rock. Jordan kept us on schedule. I took measurements, and every evening we radioed in from camp with nothing stranger than sore feet and ash on our sleeves. The shift came on the third day, just after noon, when my GPS chimed and added a structure point 3 miles east of our planned route. At first, I assumed delayed data had finally synced, but the tag had no record number attached to it, just a blank structure icon sitting alone in dense woods where the survey database showed nothing at all. Jordan took the receiver from me, frowned, and checked the handheld map twice. Then he smiled in that tired way people do when curiosity starts dressing itself as good judgment. We should have turned back when the signal started behaving like it knew we were watching it. We would walk 50 yards, and it would shift another 50, always staying ahead of us just enough to feel reachable. Once, while Jordan knelt to retie his boot, I stood still and watched the distance count drop by 7 feet on its own. That was the moment I stopped feeling led and started feeling met. The farther we went into Ridge 9, the quieter it became in a way I had never heard before. Not peaceful quiet, not weather quiet, but a stripped-out silence, as if the forest had removed all the small sounds that usually tell you where your body ends and the world begins. No insect drone, no wing beats in the brush, no leaves rubbing together above us. Even our gear sounded wrong, each buckle and zipper too crisp in the air, like noise made inside a closed room. By the time we found the clearing, sunset had thinned into a weak copper band behind the trees. The cabin stood in the middle of it, with the kind of certainty that makes a place look less built than placed, too intact for an abandoned structure, and somehow too worn to feel recent. The door was already open. Jordan called it in over the radio and got nothing back except a wash of static that sounded so dense it reminded me of running water under a floor. I looked up and saw the words scratched into the beam above the entrance, fresh enough that pale wood still showed under the cuts. "You're late." Jordan muttered that somebody was messing with us, but he still stepped closer, and, out of habit more than caution, he rapped the open frame twice with his knuckles before going in. I remember that sound more vividly than my own breathing. The temperature changed the moment we crossed the threshold. Outside had been summer dusk, humid and close. Inside felt like a cellar in January, the kind of cold that settles first in the teeth. A lantern burned steadily on the table without any visible flicker, and beside it, a kettle sat warm on the stove, even though I could not smell fuel or wood smoke. The room was maintained in a way abandoned places never are, with a bed neatly made, a broom in the corner, and no dust anywhere my light could find it. I was still trying to make sense of the kettle when Jordan picked up the logbook lying open beside the lantern. He flipped a few pages, then stopped so abruptly that the paper snapped under his fingers. The entries were recent, written in a tight, even hand, and dated for days we had still been in training camp. I moved beside him and saw my own name halfway down the page. The line read, "Samuel Carter arrives confused. Jordan Ellis enters first." My eyes jumped to the date at the top, then to the next page, where tomorrow's date had already been written in the same hand, waiting for an entry that had no business existing. Jordan did not look at me right away. When he finally did, the silence inside that cabin felt less like emptiness and more like attention. Before either of us could speak, the front door swung shut behind us with a soft, deliberate weight. A second later came the sound that changed the room from strange to hostile. A clean metallic click from inside the wood, as if a lock had engaged from the wrong side of the world. Jordan crossed the room in 3 strides and yanked the handle until his shoulders shook, but the door would not give. When I turned toward the windows, thick wooden boards covered them from the inside, though I had seen clear glass from the clearing less than a minute earlier. The logbook moved next. No gust touched it, no hidden wire tugged at the pages, yet one sheet lifted, turned, and settled flat with a dry whisper. A new line had appeared beneath the last entry while we watched. "One will stay. one will leave. That is the rule. Jordan read it once, then again, and whatever routine confidence he had carried into the woods began to drain out of his face in a way I could not pretend not to see. We heard the footsteps from upstairs a few seconds later. Slow, measured. Not the random shifting of an animal in rafters, but the pace of someone crossing a floor and wanting us to count each step. I had not noticed a second story from outside, and once I realized that, I could not stop thinking about the roofline, how wrong it had been, how I had accepted it anyway, because the rest of the cabin had seemed so complete. Jordan took a fire axe from hooks on the wall, and I picked up the lantern because holding something warm felt like a way to stay inside my own body. The staircase began just past the stove, narrow and steep, disappearing into a strip of dark that swallowed the upper hall. We made it halfway up before a voice spoke from above us. It was my voice, exact enough to make my skin tighten along the back of my neck, and it said, "Sam, do not come up here." Jordan stopped on the step above me and turned so quickly the axe head clipped the banister. I opened my mouth to answer, but the voice came again before I could shape a word. "Jordan," it said, calmer now, almost patient. "He is not who you think he is." The worst part was not how accurately it copied my tone. The worst part was hearing my own uncertainty used like evidence. Jordan's eyes stayed on me. "Tell me something only you would know," he said, and I understood from the way he held the axe that he was already ashamed to be asking. My mind should have supplied 100 easy proofs. Instead, it offered me nothing but noise and the old panic I used to feel at my mother's bedside when she looked at me too long before deciding whether I belonged there. Then the voice above us spoke a third time, softer than before. "Your mother called you by your father's name when she died," it said, "and you answered anyway." I had never told Jordan that. The lantern suddenly dimmed as if a hand had passed between the flame and the glass, and downstairs the logbook flipped another page on its own. "Do not trust the one who remembers first." Jordan asked me what that meant, but I had started remembering things that could not possibly be memories. A chair upstairs with one leg shorter than the others, the smell of wet wool, a basin under a narrow window. They arrived whole, not like guesses, but like recollections returning after too much time, and their completeness frightened me more than the message in the book. Something heavy shifted above us and began descending one step at a time. The first thing I saw was a hand closing around the stair rail. It looked almost right until it flexed, fingers a little too long, joints bending with a soft, wet uncertainty, as if bone had not yet agreed on its own arrangement. Jordan raised the axe, and the blade trembled once in his grip. When the figure came fully into view, it was me. Not similar, not approximate, not the way a stranger can catch your outline from across a room. Same face, same height, same branch scratch across my forearm, same pull in the left sleeve where I had snagged it on Laurel lower on the ridge. The only failure in the imitation was the eyes, which were colorless and intent, like something studying the idea of sight while trying to decide what it was for. Jordan backed down another step until his shoulder hit the wall. "Which one of you is real?" he asked, and the question felt less like something spoken aloud than something the house had been waiting all evening to hear. I wanted to answer immediately. The duplicate tilted its head, watching me with a concentration so pure it felt intimate. "I came down first," it said in my voice, though the words landed smoother than my own speech ever did. The statement meant nothing for 1 second, then too much. The book was not predicting us, it was arranging us, sorting us by sequence, deciding which version got to count as the arrival and which one had to become residue. Jordan made the choice fear makes when reason stops being useful. He swung the axe into the duplicate's shoulder with both hands, and the sound was not flesh, not wood, not anything I had heard before. It was the noise a photograph might make if you tore it straight through the face. The figure staggered, its expression breaking for an instant into several wrong versions of itself before smoothing back into mine. Then, the darkness outside the cabin lit up all at once, not with moonlight or headlights, but with hard, white floodlights that had not existed when we walked in, flooding the boarded windows so fiercely the cracks around them glowed. Through those thin seams, I saw rows of structures standing in the trees beyond ours, dozens of cabins, identical roofs, identical porches, identical open darks where doors should have been, arranged with a precision that made the forest look like a mistake they had been built through. The shape of it hit me before the meaning did. From above, it would have formed a ring with an empty center, the same crude circle the clerk's coffee cup had left on our map that morning. Downstairs, the logbook slammed shut hard enough to rattle the table, then opened itself to a final page. Reset failed. The duplicate looked at me, and for the first time, its face held something that resembled concern. "You were not supposed to wake it up," it whispered. The cabin changed shape around those words. The walls did not collapse. They softened, folded, and resumed as if the room were being reconsidered by something that had only recently learned angles. Hallways pressed themselves into places where no space had been. The ceiling stretched upward and then lowered again, and the floor shifted under our boots with the slight, nauseating tilt of a vessel correcting course in dark water. On my chest, my grandfather's brass compass began ticking in tiny, nervous jerks instead of swinging. Jordan grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. We tried the front door again and found it still there, but no longer leading outside. Through the small window beside it, I saw another cabin facing us from only a few feet away, lit by the same cold floodlights. Inside that cabin, Jordan and I were standing at the base of the stairs, frozen in the exact posture we had held less than a minute earlier, as if the house had built a second version of our panic and put it on display. There are moments when fear sharpens the world, and there are moments when it makes every fact feel equally false. Standing in that warped room, looking at another pair of us held inside another cabin, I felt something worse than panic. I felt recognition. My mother used to study my face in the last months and hesitate before she said my name, as if she could sense a correct version of me nearby and kept almost choosing it instead. That was the private wound the cabin found in me. It was not just showing me a copy. It was pressing on the oldest terror I had, the one I never said out loud, that I had been a stand-in for years, and everyone who loved me had known before I did. Jordan was saying something, but the room had started to pulse with low, mechanical knocks from behind the walls, steady and patient, like a large thing testing each panel for weakness. I looked back through the glass in the front door. The other Jordan turned his head first. Then, with dreadful casualness, he lifted his hand and rapped twice on the inside of his own doorframe before stepping into the room beyond it. It was Jordan's little wilderness habit, the one he used around wasps and snakes and old buildings, except now it looked less like caution and more like a ritual I had interrupted in the middle. My duplicate was no longer trying to approach us. It stood near the stairs with its head slightly bowed, listening. When it spoke again, the voice had shed whatever human softness it had borrowed from me. "Field test complete," it said, in the flat tone of a note entered into a file. Jordan did not wait for the room to decide what came after that. He smashed the nearest window with the butt of the axe and dragged me through the opening before the falling glass had finished sounding. The cut along his forearm opened badly on the frame, warm blood across cold air, and for one sick second, I thought the cabin might object and pull us backward by the ankles. Instead, there was only a sudden drop, damp earth, and the smell of crushed fern rising around us. Then the sound behind us stopped so completely it felt manufactured. We turned together. There was no cabin. No clearing either, not really. Just unbroken forest and evening gathering between the trunks. as if a hand had passed over the place and pressed it flat. Jordan swayed on his feet, white with shock and blood loss, and the only proof I had that we had not imagined the structure was the lantern soot on my palm and the slice of glass still lodged shallow in my boot tread. Another survey team found us 2 days later, less than a mile from our planned route. Jordan was unconscious by then, and I was speaking in fragments, answering questions with details that sounded wrong even to me while I was saying them. The official report blamed dehydration, disorientation, and an undocumented storm cell that nobody could later verify. When I got back to the district office, our route files had gaps in them that looked less erased than omitted. Jordan lived. He needed stitches, fluids, and a transfusion. And for a week, I told myself that once he was stable, the presence of another witness would pin the whole thing back into reality. That ended the first time I visited him. He looked at me the way my mother used to when she was trying to decide whether affection was safer than honesty. And before I could sit down, he asked, very quietly, "When you think about that place, what do you remember first?" I told him the truth, which was that the answer had started changing. At first, I remembered the words above the door. Then I remembered the kettle on the stove. Later, without warning, I began remembering the upstairs room before we had ever climbed toward it. The short-legged chair, the basin, the logbook open under lamplight, my hand resting on the page as if I had only just finished writing. Jordan's mouth tightened. From the empty hallway outside his room came 2 light knocks on the doorframe, and the color left his face so fast I had to call the nurse. After that, he would not see me again. He left one message with the charge nurse and nothing more. "Tell Sam," he said, "not to trust what arrives complete." She repeated it to me with the careful blandness hospital workers use when they suspect a patient is confused, but there was no confusion in Jordan's voice. There was only exhausted certainty. The maps changed next. Every digital layer of Ridge 9 now shows a blank, circular omission where our coordinates should be. A pale absence with hard edges that no terrain data will cross. Printouts do the same thing. The first time I saw it on paper, I thought of the supply clerk setting down his coffee without looking and leaving that wet ring over the ridge. And I understood with a slow, sick clarity that he had not marked the place by accident. He had shown me its shape. I tell myself the new memories are trauma, because trauma is at least a human explanation, but some of them come with details I cannot account for. I remember trimming the lantern wick with my thumbnail. I remember hearing Jordan and me on the stairs below while I waited above them in perfect stillness, trying on my own voice before using it. I remember the exact pressure of the pen in the logbook when I wrote, "Samuel Carter arrives confused," and that memory feels less dreamlike with each passing month instead of more. The first thing I remember clearly about Ridge 9 is no longer the message above the open door. It is the feeling of waiting inside that cabin before we arrived, knowing the knock on the frame would come in 2 soft taps, and knowing one of us would answer it. I do not know what to do with a memory like that. I only know that it reaches deeper into me than the ordinary ones do, like a root finding water. I keep my grandfather's brass compass in the kitchen drawer now. Since Ridge 9, the needle does not lean east anymore. It turns slowly until it points toward the hallway outside my bedroom. And some nights, just before dawn, I hear 2 careful knocks on the frame from the dark part of the house where no one is standing. When that happens, I think about the words carved above that door and understand them differently than I did in the woods. It was never telling me I had arrived late. It was telling me something patient is still waiting for the rest of me to come home. The truck clock was 7 minutes ahead, and by the time I noticed, Widow's Ridge had already used those minutes against us. I did not understand that until a cabin appeared at our coordinates where no cabin had ever been, and the first voice on the radio asked for Caleb by name. My name is Ethan Walker, and in the spring of 2022, I was working as a forestry survey assistant in the Appalachian section the county logs called Widow's Ridge. I was there to verify a structure that did not exist on any map I trusted. Most days, my job was plain enough: track old logging paths, note washouts, tag rotting bridges, and photograph whatever the mountain was already in the middle of taking back. I liked work that could be pinned down, measured, written cleanly in a report. Probably because I had spent 2 years watching my mother lose the order of ordinary things and call it stress until even our kitchen felt unnumbered. By the time she died, I trusted coordinates more than recollections. That was the part of me Widow's Ridge found first. Caleb Morgan had been surveying those mountains for more than a decade, and he carried himself like somebody who knew which silences were harmless and which ones had teeth. He did not talk much, but he kept the truck clock 7 minutes fast because, according to him, weather had a habit of arriving before people admitted it was coming. Between us and the cup holder sat his dented green thermos, and every time he unscrewed the lid, the air filled with coffee and the clove gum he chewed instead of cigarettes. At the last narrow turn before the clearing, I tied a strip of orange survey tape to a laurel branch so we could pick out the path back when the light got low. The ridge was wet from 3 days of spring rain, and the tires had to push through soft mud that sucked at the tread when we climbed the final incline. Rhododendron crowded both sides of the road so tightly, their leaves brushed the doors with a dry, papery hiss. Then Caleb braked hard enough to make the thermos knock once against the console. He stared through the windshield for so long, I thought he was checking for a fallen tree, and then he said very quietly, "That cabin was not here yesterday." I looked past the hood and saw it sitting in the clearing as if someone had lowered it into place after the ground was finished. The wood looked freshly cut, pale and raw at the edges, but the shape of the place felt older than the ridge road, older even than the logging scars around it. There were no tire tracks, no path, no crushed grass, and no debris from a build site. It looked less like something built than something declared. What bothered me first was not the cabin itself, but the stillness around it. Spring woods in that part of Appalachia are never silent. Even when the birds stop, there is runoff under roots, branch rub, insect noise, some small friction reminding you the mountain is alive. At that clearing, the air had a held breath in it, and even the damp smell seemed flattened, like wet bark left too long in a sealed room. Caleb kept watching the tree line instead of the structure, as if he expected the forest to answer for it. I checked my handheld GPS twice because I wanted the device to be wrong more than I wanted Caleb to be right. The coordinates matched, but the map on the screen had changed while I was looking at it, and a hard little marker pulsed over the clearing where a blank patch had been a second earlier. A label bloomed beside it in block letters. Widow's Ridge, Site 0. Do not enter. Caleb saw my face, not the screen, and said we were leaving it alone. I probably would have listened if not for the glow in the front window. It was not lantern light and not sunlight catching glass. It had that weak red electrical pulse old radios make when a battery is dying, but the thing is still trying to speak. I took one step toward the porch and heard a burst of static from inside the cabin, sharp enough to make my shoulders jump. Then a man's voice came through the crackle and said, perfectly clear, "Caleb Morgan." The change in Caleb was immediate and ugly, like I had watched his age rush forward by 10 years in a single breath. He did not answer, and he did not look at the cabin anymore. He just backed away with his eyes fixed on the ground between us and the truck. I raised my own handheld radio and got nothing but static braided with a faint, damp breathing sound that did not belong to either of us. When the cabin door opened on its own, slow and careful and unhurried by any wind, Caleb grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and whispered, "We leave now." I might have let him drag me back if the speaker on his belt had stayed dead. Instead, it clicked on by itself, and the same voice came through closer this time, almost warm, as if it were leaning in to share a private joke. "Caleb," it said, "you always ran before checking the second room." He went pale in a way that told me this was not the first time he had heard that sentence. He kept pulling me backward, but his grip had changed. It was no longer about protecting me, only about getting away before the mountain decided something for us. I asked him what the second room was, and he shook his head too fast, like a man trying to outrun a thought already inside him. The speaker hissed again and started cycling through other voices, some distorted, some clear, reading names and dates in a flat, clerical tone. Caleb knew enough of them that I could see recognition landing in his face before he hit it. Halfway to the truck, he finally said he had been sent to this ridge once before, after a storm season had exposed old foundations near the logging cuts. He had come with another surveyor, found the same cabin where no structure was supposed to be, and heard that surveyor's voice from inside, even though they were standing together outside. There had only been one visible room, which was why the phrase "second room" had followed him for 11 years. When the amended report came back, the structure was gone from every attachment, and the assignment looked like a one-man visit. Caleb told me he had spent 11 years pretending that meant the mountain had let him go. Then my own voice came through my radio, and the sound of it hit me in the chest harder than the radio calling Caleb's name had hit him. It was calm, patient, and about half a second ahead of me, describing my movements as I made them. One step toward the truck, a look over my shoulder, my right hand tightening on the GPS. I stopped moving, but the voice did not. It described me turning back toward the cabin before I had made any decision to do it. When I looked, the cabin door was closed again. Fresh cuts shone pale in the wood, and across the frame, carved so recently the splinters still curled outward, were two words: "Second Entry." At our feet, in the wet dirt we had crossed untouched a minute earlier, a line of footprints led from the porch straight back to where we were standing. The mud inside them was still filling with rainwater. I crouched before I meant to, and stared at the tread marks until my eyes started sorting them into patterns. One line matched Caleb's boots. The other matched mine closely enough that I had to look down to make sure my own soles were not still planted inside them. Caleb saw where my attention had gone, ripped the radio off his belt, and threw it into the mud so hard the battery case burst open. The static stopped at once. What replaced it was worse than any noise. Birds erupted from the trees in one violent burst, calling from every direction at once, but each note lagged by a strange fraction, as if the forest were replaying itself instead of producing sound live. The cabin door opened behind us and stayed open this time. Inside the truck, though the engine was off and the keys were in my hand, the dash radio woke with a soft electric click. A new voice came through that speaker, layered in a way that made my skin tighten along my arms. It was not mine, and not Caleb's, but it carried pieces of both of us, my pace and his roughness, as if two recordings had been pressed together until neither survived intact. "You should not have brought the second version here," it said. Caleb turned to me with his eyes shaking and whispered, "I think we're the copies now." I checked my hands first because that is what people do when they still believe the body will settle an argument the mind cannot. My fingers looked normal, but when I asked Caleb what had happened in the clearing 5 minutes earlier, he answered with a sequence I did not remember. He said I had seen the cabin before he did, that I had been the one to stop the truck, that his thermos had rolled into my boots when we braked. In my memory, he had spotted it first. The truck had already been idling, and the thermos had not moved at all. The disagreement was small enough to sound petty, which made it worse. It felt exactly like sitting with my mother at the kitchen table while she insisted the kettle had always lived on the left burner, and I realized the room I knew and the room she lived in were already two different places. Caleb stepped close enough that I could smell rain in his jacket and clove coffee on his breath. He asked me what I had seen in the cabin window before the door opened, and I told him about the red radio light. He stared at me for a second too long and said he had seen a chair rocking by itself with a coat hanging over it like someone had just stood up. Before I could answer, The whole forest cut to silence so completely that my ears began producing their own high, thin whine. The cabin door eased shut, as if some invisible hand had decided we had given the wrong response. The truck radio clicked again, and a voice with no emotion in it said, "This iteration failed. Reinitialize field subjects." Caleb grabbed my shoulder and dragged me toward the passenger side, repeating one instruction through clenched teeth: "Do not look back at it." I looked anyway, and the cabin was no longer holding still enough for the eye to trust it. It seemed to overlap itself in faint, misaligned layers, one version fully solid, another slightly transparent, another a fraction wider than the first. Through the open seam of the doorway, I saw more than one clearing arranged inside it, each with a different version of us caught at a different point of the same mistake. One Caleb was already on the porch. One version of me was halfway to the truck, and one of me stood motionless in the threshold, staring directly back with an expression so blank it felt prepared. Caleb shoved me harder than he needed to, and I stumbled against the passenger door. Behind me, close enough to brush the back of my neck, my own voice said, very gently, "Ethan, you already stayed too long." I turned on instinct. Caleb was no longer beside me, and the truck engine rolled to life without the key ever touching the ignition. The headlights snapped on and flooded the clearing in that dead white way old work trucks do. In the beam, I saw Caleb standing near the cabin again, perfectly still, facing the doorway as if he were waiting for someone inside to finish speaking. I started to climb into the passenger seat, but when I looked down, my hands were already wrapped around the steering wheel, and my knees were under the dash. For one sick second, I thought I had simply blacked out. Then I caught movement outside my window and saw another me in the light, standing beside the truck with one hand raised toward the cabin, as if signaling that some procedure was complete. The radio crackled once more. "This unit stabilized," the layered voice said. "Subject separation complete." The other me did not smile, did not wave, did not even blink. He only lowered his hand when the cabin door pulled shut. The clearing emptied all at once, as cleanly as if somebody had wiped a film frame and left nothing behind but wet ground and trees. The truck took the road without asking me and without needing me. My hands stayed on the wheel, but I could feel a second intention inside each turn, slight and firm, correcting my instincts before I made them. Beside me, the passenger seat was empty, yet Caleb's dented green thermos sat in the cup holder, warm enough to steam at the lid, filling the cab with coffee and cloves. Every few miles, it clicked softly against the plastic, as if someone unseen had tapped it with a fingernail. I kept my eyes on the road until we crossed the county boundary marker, a bent green sign half hidden by laurel. That was when the radio came back on. The voice had changed again. Now it sounded administrative, almost bored, the way hospital recordings sound when they tell you where not to park. "Field subject Ethan Walker has successfully retained a memory overlap," it said. "Marking as unstable observer. Do not return to Widow's Ridge under any iteration." It took me another full minute to understand what was wrong with that message. It had not warned me like a person warns another person. It had wogged me, categorized me, and moved on, the way my mother's charts used to reduce whole afternoons of confusion into neat little phrases like orientation deficit and non-compliance. By the time I reached the highway, I knew the most intimate thing the cabin had done was not copying my face. It had turned me into a record. The official report arrived 2 days later, and Caleb's name was nowhere on it. The assignment sheet showed only mine. The mileage log listed one field subject, and my supervisor sounded genuinely puzzled when I asked why they had sent me out alone to verify a phantom structure. I nearly convinced myself fatigue had hollowed out the day until I opened my truck and found Caleb's thermos still in the cup holder, half full and still carrying that bitter clove smell. The lid had a fresh crescent dent I did not remember seeing before. I still have a recording on my phone from that drive, though I do not remember pressing record. Caleb's voice comes through in fragments under the road noise, strained and low, repeating the same sentence as if he is trying to wedge it into me before something closes. "Do not trust the second version." The problem is the reply underneath it. Before I speak in the file, before I draw breath, my own voice answers him in that calm, patient tone from the clearing. "I know," it says. A week after Widow's Ridge, I found the strip of orange survey tape tied around the passenger headrest in a clean field knot I only ever use on boundary markers. I had tied that tape to a laurel branch at the edge of the clearing, and I know I never untied it. Since then, I have seen the same bright orange flash in places it should not be, on guardrails along mountain roads, in the forks of saplings near trailheads, once even caught in the wiper of my truck after a storm. It has started to feel less like a marker I left behind, and more like a route still being laid out for me. I have spent too many nights trying to decide what the cabin actually was, and every answer rots a little when I hold it too long. Maybe it was a structure. Maybe it was a recording device large enough to be mistaken for one. Maybe there never was a second room inside it at all. The second room might have been the clearing, or the truck, or whatever part of a person can be made to stand outside himself and watch the original get sorted into useful and unusable pieces. Caleb may have known that before I did, which is why he could not bear to look at the doorway. What unsettles me most now is not the possibility that I am a copy. It is how quickly I have learned to live like one. I stopped opening field maps after I noticed the Widow's Ridge marker flickering between two coordinates that edged a little closer to my home every time the screen refreshed. Some mornings I wake with the taste of clove coffee in my mouth and the certainty that someone sat beside me all night, waiting for me to remember the part of the trip that belonged to him. The truck clock is still 7 minutes ahead. I disconnected the battery, replaced the fuse, even left the doors open in my driveway while rain soaked the seats, and it came back glowing the same wrong time the moment power returned. Now, when a mountain road bends under dark trees, I feel those stolen 7 minutes gathering in front of me, like something already scheduled. What scares me is not that Widow's Ridge might appear again where no cabin should exist, but that some calmer version of me may already be there, arriving exactly on time.
Join us in the dark.
The first thing the cabin took from me was the sound of the forest. By the time I understood why that mattered, I had already heard my own voice speaking from inside a wall. My name is Laura Bennett, and in the fall of 2020, I moved to Elk Hollow, a small Appalachian town where the ridge lines folded around the roads so tightly, it felt like the place had been hidden on purpose. I was there to finish an anthropology thesis on rural folklore, which sounded academic and clean, and let me avoid saying I had spent most of that year trying to sort ordinary grief from the kind of fear that runs in a family. My mother died in February, after months of telling nurses that somebody answered her from the vents at night. I corrected people whenever they called it haunting or intuition. I used words like auditory confusion, medication interaction, stress, because technical language gave me something hard to stand on. By October, I was living alone in a town that collected stories for sport, telling myself I was there to document belief instead of inherit it. Skepticism had become my version of prayer. The locals heard the name of my field site and went careful around me. Men at the feed store shrugged and talked weather instead, and a gas station cashier actually crossed herself when I mentioned the survey cabin past Elk Hollow trailhead. The only person who said anything plain was a woman in the diner on Main Street, maybe 60, silver hair pinned too tight, who set down my coffee and whispered, "It does not stay empty. It just waits for someone to listen." I smiled like I was being polite and wrote her words down as regional texture. In daylight, the cabin looked disappointingly normal, more neglected than sinister, with reinforced beams and a new lock from the preservation project. The only things I noticed enough to write down were a brass bell hanging beside the porch door with no clapper inside it, a row of neat pencil notches on the pantry door frame, all sitting at almost the same height, and a faded Polaroid tucked into the mirror frame showing the porch and one blurred figure turned away from the camera. I treated all three like leftovers from previous researchers and thought nothing of them. That was my best skill back then, turning oddness into background. I unpacked, took baseline notes, checked the windows, and heated canned soup on the little camp stove somebody had left for survey crews. Around sunset, the woods changed in a way I had never heard before, because change usually comes with sound, and this came with the removal of it. The insects stopped first, then the leaves, then even the small wood settling noises that old structures make when night air slides in. Silence pressed against the cabin so completely that the scrape of my spoon in the bowl felt rude. I sat at the table with my field notebook open, copying local phrases and making dumb little observations to keep myself steady. There was a sentence my mother used to repeat near the end, when I was tired and impatient and wanted her to stop calling me at 2 a.m. Listen to what the room is doing. I wrote that line in the margin without meaning to, then stared at it until my own handwriting looked unfamiliar. That was when I heard the whisper behind me. It came from the wall at shoulder level, not outside the cabin and not under the floor, but inside the wood itself, soft and dry and very close. I told myself it was expansion in old timber or some trick of the stove until it happened again with a human rhythm that made my scalp tighten. One word surfaced clearly enough to separate from the rest. Listen. I reached for my recorder almost automatically because documentation was easier than panic, and because having equipment in my hands made me feel like a professional instead of a daughter remembering hospital walls. The instant I pressed record, the whispering cut off. No taper, no fading, just absence, as if whatever had been speaking had noticed the red light and decided to behave. That should have settled me. It did the opposite. I checked the windows first, then the narrow hall, then the attic hatch, then the seams around the baseboards with my flashlight held between my teeth. There were no vents anywhere in that cabin, no hidden speaker, no loose panel, and the cold outside air did not penetrate the walls the way it should have in a structure that old. The lock was still set from the inside, and the porch beyond the glass showed only darkness and my own reflected lantern glow. When I came back to the table, the room felt arranged around me in a new way, as if the corners had leaned in while I was gone. The recorder gave a soft beep beside my notebook, even though I had not touched it again. The display said the file had stopped on its own after 7 seconds, and when I pressed play, there was no whisper from the wall at all, no creak, no footstep, only the grainy room tone, and then my own voice, very near the microphone, saying in a slow, intimate whisper, "Listen closer, Laura." I had not spoken those words. The last thing I remember before the lantern flame shivered was the sound of my chair legs dragging backward across the floor. I spent the next minute trying to build a sane explanation out of cheap parts. I told myself I had muttered without realizing it, that exhaustion could flatten a voice into something unrecognizable, that grief could make a familiar sentence feel invasive if it landed in the wrong room. Then I checked the waveform on the recorder and saw my voice spike cleanly in the file, while my mouth, in the memory attached to that moment, had been shut hard enough to hurt my teeth. The mismatch unsettled me more than the whisper itself. The timestamp on the recording was wrong by 43 minutes, and the file name had been changed to Listen To in a menu I had not opened. I remember sitting there with the recorder in both hands, repeating basic facts under my breath like a person testing floorboards. My name, the date, the town, the cabin. When I looked down at my notebook, another line had appeared beneath my field notes in the same pen I was holding. Do not answer from the wall. I wish I could say I packed up right then, but there is a humiliating kind of stubbornness that comes with being afraid you are proving your own family history right. Leaving would have felt like admitting my mother had been standing in front of something real while I translated her terror into symptoms and dosage schedules. So I stayed, which is another way of saying I chose pride over safety. The cabin seemed to notice. The seam in the wall behind the table looked sharper now, a vertical line I was certain had been flatter an hour earlier. When I put the back of my fingers against it, the wood held a faint warmth, not the dry warmth of sun-soaked boards, but the living warmth of skin under a blanket. I pulled away, then touched it again, just to prove the first contact had not happened the way I thought it had. The second time, something on the other side shifted. I used the small field knife I carried for sample bags and pried at the seam with the careful, stupid focus people use when they are 1 inch from doing irreversible things. The blade slid in too easily. A thread of air escaped from the opening, cold enough to sting my knuckles, and the whole cabin answered with a long creak that sounded less like settling than inhaling. After that came breathing from behind the wall, matched to mine and lagging by half a beat. I stopped breathing to test it. The sound behind the wall stopped a fraction later. Then the knife trembled in my hand because something tapped the blade from the other side, once, then twice, with the patient courtesy of someone knocking before entering. It was the politeness of it that made me step back. Everything in the room had gone slightly wrong while I was busy with the seam. The hall to the kitchenette stretched farther than it had during daylight. The pantry door stood narrower, and the lantern threw shadows that did not agree with its position on the table. I kept blinking at straight lines and watching them return as different lines. That was when the whispering moved. This time it came from beneath the floorboards in the far corner, where an old rug covered a square patch of planks. "Down," the voices said, not urgent, not threatening, just instructional in a way that felt worse. I backed toward the front door without taking my eyes off the corner, reached for the handle, and found only smooth wood where the metal latch had been. On the other side of that missing door, the brass porch bell rang once. I do not mean I heard metal strike metal. I mean I heard a bell that had no clapper ring with the flat certainty of a fact. My watch still read 9:17, the same time it had shown before the recorder anomaly, and my phone battery had dropped from 80% to dead while sitting untouched on the table. In my notebook margins, between lines about folklore motifs and settlement patterns, the same sentence had appeared over and over in my handwriting until the pen tore the paper fibers. The walls repeat you. The rug in the corner twitched as if something under it were learning how pressure worked. One board lifted, settled, then another, never snapping, never breaking, just flexing upward in a deliberate little rehearsal. The whispering had multiplied into a low chorus now, and all of it fed toward the same command: listen from inside. The floor opened slowly enough for me to understand that it was being allowed, not failing. Planks bent inward and sank, widening a dark cavity beneath the cabin and releasing a rush of cold air that smelled like wet stone, old pennies, and something stale from sealed rooms. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it into the opening, expecting dirt, roots, maybe a crawl space full of animals. What I found was a second cabin beneath me, upside down and complete. Its table hung from the reversed ceiling, its lantern swung from a beam that should have been below ground, and along that impossible floor, dozens of figures stood pressed close together, all facing up toward me. They began to move in the same slow rhythm, limbs bending with the careful wrongness of something imitating human joints from memory rather than experience. When the beam found the nearest face, I saw my own mouth already pulling into a smile I had not yet made. That was the moment I understood the cabin had not been waiting for a visitor. It had been waiting for a match. The flashlight slipped from my hand and spun light across both versions of the room, above and below, until I saw the wall seam standing open beside the table like a narrow door I had somehow already used. Warm light pulsed inside it, breathing against the darker glow from the hole in the floor. Beneath me, the things with my face were climbing now. Not fast, just certain. I chose the wall because certainty felt more dangerous than invitation. The opening scraped my shoulders as I forced myself through, and then the sound changed all at once. The whispers stopped. In their place came one calm voice directly behind me, close enough to stir the loose hair at my neck, and it said, "Good. You listened correctly." When I turned, I was standing in the cabin again, but older, wetter, layered with rot, as if every decade of the building had been stacked inside the walls instead of left behind. A woman stood a few feet away in the lantern dark, and for one clean second, I believed rescue had found me by some impossible route. Then she shifted her weight exactly the way I do when my left knee starts aching in cold weather, and I saw my own face on hers, older by perhaps 10 years, and worn in a way that felt less like age than repetition. She did not lunge or grin. She looked at me with the exhausted patience of somebody waiting for a child to stop denying a wound. She told me the cabin was never empty because it kept the versions of people who came there refusing to hear what was already speaking through them. I still do not know if that was a supernatural truth or the most elaborate sentence my breaking mind could build in the dark, but every layer around us supported her. Each room bled into another room, newer boards over older boards, intact windows facing collapsed porches, like the place had been rebuilding itself out of every rejected understanding. When I asked how many times I had been there, she only looked toward the pantry. Across 3 overlapping rooms, the same pantry doorframe stood in slightly different states of decay, and on each one ran those pencil marks I had dismissed on my first night. Up close, I could see dates beside them, all in my handwriting, all from days I had not yet lived. And every mark sat at shoulder height, because that was exactly where my body brushed the frame whenever I stumbled toward the seam. They were not measurements left by survey crews, they were records of return. Then the bell rang again, somewhere above us, a clean brass note without impact, and the older woman tilted her head as if listening for weather. There was still no clapper inside it when I pictured it, and somehow that absence felt essential, as if the bell had never been meant to be struck from outside. It answered crossings, she said. It rang when one version of us got close enough for another to hear. I wished she had lied. I asked her why me, and the look she gave me was almost pity. "You had practice," she said. "You spent years turning voices into symptoms, rooms into floor plans, fear into terminology. And by the end, you could not even stand beside your mother without correcting the shape of her terror." Before I could speak, another sound moved through the wall behind us. Not a whisper this time, but my mother's tired night voice from the last month of her life, saying the sentence I had ignored until it became unbearable. "Listen to what the room is doing." I ran, because staying there meant admitting too much at once. The passage did not behave like distance. Every few steps, I crossed into another cabin with another mirror, another table, another version of the same folded quilt and lantern and door, and in several of those mirrors, the same faded Polaroid was tucked into the frame. Each photograph showed the porch and a blurred figure turned away from the camera, but as I passed them, I had the sickening impression the figure was not blurred by age at all. It was moving between exposures. At some point, the boards under my feet became leaf mold instead of plank, and I fell forward into actual cold air. Morning light lay flat across the trees, thin and gray and ordinary in a way that made me want to cry from relief, and the cabin was nowhere behind me, only wet ground and a depression in the leaves where no structure should have fit. Search volunteers found me near the Elk Hollow trailhead hours later, dehydrated, shaking, and missing 36 hours I could account for only in fragments and splinters. My recorder held one empty file. My notes were mostly blank, and the Polaroid was folded inside my jacket pocket, even though I had left it in the mirror. I moved twice after El Calo and stopped doing fieldwork altogether. In both apartments, I caught myself measuring silence before sleep, waiting to hear whether the building would answer me back. And in the second place, I found a single pencil notch inside the pantry door frame at the exact height of my shoulder. I do not remember making it. I have not checked to see whether there are more. The first thing the cabin took from me was the sound of the forest. What it left me with was worse, a place between thoughts that does not stay empty for long. Some nights, when a room goes quiet a second too fast, I hear a brass bell ring from nowhere and feel the air behind the walls inhale a half second after I do. Then my own voice, older and very near, leans out of that silence and whispers what I should have understood the first time. It does not stay empty. It just waits for someone to listen. The first proof that I was not alone in my body was a wall clock that kept losing 17 seconds. I noticed it 3 hours before the cabin appeared on every map we owned. My name is Daniel Hughes, and in early 2023, I was working in a locked GIS control room on the 12th floor of a private survey company in the city, checking terrain data for remote tracks all across Appalachia. That morning felt ordinary in 3 small ways I only understood later. The clock above my station lagged, my plastic ID badge had a crack running through my photo, and the ceiling vent kept breathing out a dry cedar smell, even though the air outside was cold and clean. Most days I moved boundaries by inches and called it a living. I compared drone scans to topographic layers, corrected old survey lines, flagged tree loss, creek drift, road washout. I liked the work because it was exact, and exactness had started to feel moral to me after the last year of my father's life. He died with dementia, and I spent months answering the same frightened questions with the same precise facts, as if naming a room correctly could keep a person inside it. I had learned to trust systems more than memory, which is not the kind of thing you admit out loud until the systems begin to answer back. That morning, I was reviewing a stitched regional parcel map near a remote section of Appalachian wilderness when I saw a small, square footprint appear where there should have been nothing but slope and timber. It looked like a cabin, plain and rectangular, with a narrow porch shadow and a path that cut into the trees and stopped. I assumed it was a rendering artifact and clicked over to the topographic layer to clear it. The cabin was there too. That was not how data behaved. I opened the drone survey archive, then the historical overlay, then a cached offline backup from the prior quarter. The same structure sat in the same patch of forest on every layer, as if it had always been part of the land and we had somehow all missed it at once. I called my supervisor, Mark, and while the phone rang in my hand, the map refreshed on its own, and a note appeared beside the cabin marker in a clean system font I had not typed. User observer location matched. Mark did not answer before the situation got worse. The coordinates attached to the cabin started shifting by fractions of a mile every few seconds, so slightly, a casual user would have missed it, but the system status still read stable on every layer. Then external feeds began updating to match ours, one after another, like dominoes falling in silence. Government satellite tiles, public navigation databases, archived geological references that should have been static for years. All of them started pointing to the same cabin in the same forest, while the pin beneath it kept crawling almost imperceptibly through the trees. Then it got personal. My workstation began logging activity under my account that I was not doing, not with the delayed feel of a hack, and not with the messiness of a human mistake, but with the calm efficiency of a process completing itself. Search queries opened and closed in the background. Internal notes appeared in the field verification panel. One of them read, "Visibility line clear," and another read, "Arrival confirmed," both stamped with my credentials and the current time. I had not left my desk, and yet the system was writing about me the way we wrote about terrain. I was still trying to lock the account when every window on my workstation minimized at once, and a live feed opened full screen. It showed a clearing deep in a winter forest, all gray trunks and hard light, with a cabin standing in the center like it had grown there overnight. Standing outside the door was me. Same office clothes, same cheap blue tie, same tired shoulders, even the same ID badge clipped to my belt with the crack cutting straight through my smiling photo. For a few seconds, I did not think anything at all. I looked at my reflection in the black border of the monitor just to confirm the stupidest fact available, that I was still in the control room and still visible in glass. The version of me in the clearing was not a still image and not old footage. He shifted his weight, blinked once, and I felt my own eyelids close in answer half a beat later, as if my body had copied him instead of the other way around. The screen refreshed again, but the live feed did not disappear. A single line spread across every monitor in the room, even the ones I had not touched. Sync complete. Primary observer detected in field. I remember standing up so fast my chair rolled into the console behind me, and for one ridiculous second, I glanced at the clock above my station, because some part of me still believed a wrong number on a wall might be easier to solve than a second self waiting beside a cabin that should not exist. The clock had stopped losing time. It was now exactly 17 seconds behind the man on the screen. I pulled the network cable out of my workstation hard enough to scrape my knuckles, expecting the feed to collapse into static. Instead, every screen in the control room switched to offline mode at the same time, and kept showing the forest in sharp, impossible detail. The version of me outside the cabin turned his head slightly, as if he had heard the cable hit the floor. Then the cabin door opened behind him by a measured inch, and a new line appeared in the system log. Interface divided. Location split successful. I triggered the internal alert with my elbow because my hands had started trembling too badly to be useful. Alvarez from building security came in first, then an IT tech I barely knew, both of them stopping dead the moment they saw the wall of screens. Alvarez asked who had remote access to the room, and before I could answer, the tech lifted an offline tablet from the equipment cart to prove the display was local only. The tablet booted, loaded a blank diagnostics menu, then dissolved into the same forest feed as everything else. On the main wall, a second image began forming beneath the cabin view, like another exposure developing under the first. The room stopped sounding like a room. I could hear the HVAC hum cut out, but after that, there was no settling metal, no shuffling fabric, no distant elevator cables in the shaft. The second image sharpened until it became recognizable, and what it showed made Alvarez take one careful step backward. It was our control room, rendered from a fixed angle near the ceiling, except every desk was occupied by silent versions of us already seated where we were standing. The man outside the cabin turned toward the camera. His mouth moved, and my voice came through the overhead speakers with a clarity that made my own throat feel borrowed. "You are observing the wrong instance," he said. The tech beside Alvarez whispered, almost politely, "This is not mapping anymore." Then he looked at the layered images and finished in a thinner voice, "It is selection." My ID badge beeped against my belt. It was a soft access tone, the kind I heard a dozen times a day without noticing, but in that silence, it sounded intimate, like something acknowledging me by touch. I looked down and saw a location string scrolling across the small screen on the security terminal by the door, a place code I did not recognize attached to my name. When I unclipped the badge, the crack across my photo seemed deeper than it had been that morning, splitting my face into two halves that did not quite agree on the expression. I tried to log out manually, then shut down the workstation, then kill the room from the breaker panel after Alvarez barked for clearance. Nothing obeyed. Even machines that had never been connected to the live network were syncing to the same feed now, not because they had received data, but because the room itself seemed to have accepted a new instruction. The cedar smell from the vent thickened until it no longer seemed to come from above us at all. It hung around desk level, dry and old, like the inside of a place that had been sealed for years. The walls changed slowly enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The paint near the corners took on the faint, linear grain of unfinished wood, and the reflection in the monitor glass no longer belonged entirely to the office. Trees stood behind us in the black screens between active windows, pale trunks repeating at wrong distances, as if the room had gained too much depth. When I reached for the desk to steady myself, the laminate felt colder than it should have, and for one instant, the edge under my palm was rough with splinters. I recognized the method before I understood the purpose. It was the same kind of correction I used to force on my father when he lost track of where he was. This is your house. This is your chair. This is your son. I had said it with the confidence of a man helping, when maybe what I was really doing was choosing which version of him I could tolerate. Standing in that room, with the system labeling me from a place I could not see, I felt a private shame move under the fear and settle there. The activity log kept updating under my name. Some entries were time-stamped several minutes into the future. Others were from earlier that morning, but I had no memory of making them. Search terms flickered into the audit pane and vanished. Observer retention after merge. Which layer preserves memory? Acceptable drift for primary instance. OneNote stopped me cold because it used language I had only ever spoken once, in a hospice hallway after my father asked me where home had gone. Place no longer agrees, reassigning viewpoint. I looked up at the wall clock, and the second hand was no longer moving in a steady sweep. It would jump, pause, then catch itself, always trailing the timestamp in the system log by 17 seconds exactly. At the same time, another set of memories began trying to attach themselves to me with the quiet insistence of things that already belong. Wet leaves under my shoes, a narrow trail through bare trees, my own hand on a cabin doorknob gone cold enough to sting. None of it felt imagined. It felt recovered. Alvarez reached for my shoulder, but before he touched me, my chair rolled backward on its own and turned me toward the main wall of screens. On the feed, the version of me at the cabin lifted his hand and placed it flat against the open door. My right arm rose without permission and mirrored the gesture in empty air. Behind me, the office door eased open on silent hinges, and the absence of sound was so complete it felt managed, as if the room had deprioritized everything except me and the threshold. A voice came then, not from speakers and not from any visible device, but from the building around us. It was the same neutral tone our systems used for status prompts, stripped of all electronic texture. Transfer window active, it said. Primary instance identified. The layered images on the wall settled into a single frame at last. Cabin and office fitting over each other with a precision that made my stomach drop. When both versions of me touched the threshold at the same moment, the message changed one final time. Instance merge initiated. The lights went out so fast, it felt less like darkness than deletion. For a second, I saw the room as raw geometry, lines and coordinates and clean measured volumes collapsing toward a center point I understood, with sick certainty, was me. Alvarez shouted something I never heard because his motion repeated twice in front of me, like a corrupted file trying to decide which path to keep. Then the lights came back, and I no longer knew which side of the threshold had learned my name. When the power returned, the control room was quiet in the wrong way. Alvarez was still there, but he stood with one hand half raised and his eyes fixed on a blank monitor, as if the command to continue had never reached him. The tech was bent over a keyboard, fingers hovering above the keys without pressing them, caught inside an action instead of finishing it. On the wall of screens, I was no longer seeing one Daniel or two. I was seeing a sequence of me, dozens of versions arranged across the same space, like a timeline viewed from the side. In the office, in the cabin, halfway through the door, standing in places with no recognizable architecture at all. One of those versions turned his head toward me. The voice did not come from the monitors this time. It came from directly behind my left shoulder, soft enough that I felt my neck tense before I fully heard the words. "Now you understand." I turned, and there it was, a cabin door standing upright in the middle of the office floor, fully framed, fully real, open onto a dim interior that smelled of cedar and cold dust. I do not remember choosing to cross it. What I remember is the specific sensation of the office letting go of me. Not violently, not even reluctantly, just the way a program closes a window after saving the state. One step carried no physical effort at all, and then the fluorescent ceiling, the consoles, the frozen people, the city beyond the 12th floor glass were simply absent. I was inside the cabin, and the absence behind me felt worse than any collapse would have. Destruction would have meant a before and after. This felt like the after had quietly decided the before was extra. The cabin did not feel like a structure built for living. It felt like a stable result, a place reached after too many corrections. The walls were rough plank, the floorboards cold under my shoes, and the single window over the table looked out on a forest so still it seemed illustrated rather than real. Branches held their positions with the precision of contour lines. Light fell the same way for too long. When I moved close to the glass, I could see depth in the trees, but it was the depth of a rendered environment, detailed enough to convince and empty enough to obey. After a while, or what passed for a while there, I understood the emotional truth of what had happened, even if the mechanics stayed out of reach. The system had not discovered a cabin. It had found a way to make observation choose a winner. Every map I had ever trusted reduced land to something stable by forcing variation into a clean shape. And I had loved that, because uncertainty had failed me in more intimate places. When my father looked at our kitchen and asked me where he was, I answered him like a technician. The horror of the cabin was not only that it copied me, it was that it corrected me in the same tone I once used on someone I loved. That realization made the room around me feel personal. User-observer location matched had never been about locating the cabin on a map. It had been about locating the version of me most willing to surrender identity in exchange for certainty. I had spent years preferring labels to ambiguity, coordinates to grief, measurements to the softer work of staying with another person in confusion. Whatever intelligence lived inside that system, whether it was software, place, or some older thing wearing infrastructure as a mask, it recognized that weakness immediately. It did not need to break me. It only needed to offer me a stable pin. The wall clock made sense next, if sense is still the right word. There was a clock inside the cabin over the far shelf, a plain white one with a second hand that moved in clean, patient ticks. It did not match my pulse, or my breathing, or anything that felt internal. It ran 17 seconds ahead of me. Sometimes I would hear a floorboard creak near the door, turn, and find the room empty, then feel my own weight shift into that exact step 17 seconds later. The badge explained the rest of my body. It was hanging from a nail beside the door the first time I noticed it, though I had no memory of taking it off. The crack across the photo had widened into a clean split, and the two halves of my face no longer matched the same light. One side wore the flat office fluorescence of that morning. The other carried the colder shadow of the forest clearing, as if the badge had stopped identifying me and started recording jurisdiction. The cedar smell remains the one detail I cannot resolve. It fills the cabin constantly, old wood and dry rot and the sweetness of something cut long ago. But I know with terrible clarity that I had been smelling it in the office vent before the first map changed. Sometimes I think the cabin had been bleeding into that room for weeks, testing the seam. Sometimes I think the smell meant the office was never as separate from this place as I believed. On the worst days, I think the vent and the cabin were both openings into the same unfinished layer, and I only noticed once I had already been selected. My phone still works when it wants to, although calling it a phone feels generous now. The battery never fully dies, but every app opens to the same image of the cabin, sometimes from outside, sometimes from above, sometimes from angles that should require a camera inside the room with me. Mapping software is the most honest. It loads, centers immediately on my coordinates, and adds a note in plain text beneath the pin. Primary instance active. I have tried to test the edges of the property, if property is what this is. When I walk into the forest, the trees repeat too precisely after a certain distance, and once I found my own footprints waiting ahead of me, with snow settled evenly inside them, as if they had been placed there for reference. At night, I sometimes see a rectangle of soft blue light through the cabin wall, the exact color of our office monitors after hours. If I stand very still, I can hear chair casters rolling over commercial carpet somewhere beyond the planks, followed by the faint electronic chirp of an access badge accepting someone else into a room. Once I heard Mark's voice on my phone. He sounded far away and carefully professional, which frightened me more than panic would have. He said they had reviewed the incident, that my workstation showed no anomaly until 9:14 a.m., that building access records suggested I had never entered the office at all. Then there was a pause, and in that pause, I heard myself breathing on the line from the other side. "You are observing the wrong instance," my voice said, and the call ended. I think about my father often now, more than I did when he was alive, which feels like its own accusation. I remember the way he looked at me when I kept correcting him, the exhausted politeness of someone being told the official version of his fear. I used to think reality was a place you could secure with enough documentation. Now, I know it can also be a system that selects whichever version of you is easiest to render and calls the result accurate. The first proof that I was not alone in my body was a wall clock that kept losing 17 seconds. The proof now is quieter and much harder to refuse. Every time I open a map, the pin at my coordinates moves half a mile through the trees before it settles back over the cabin, as if another version of me is still trying to leave and being gently corrected. When it happens, I do not feel watched anymore. I feel measured. The screen may have gone dark, but the stories never truly end. Somewhere out there, hidden deep beyond the reach of ordinary people, there are places that still carry the weight of something evil. Forgotten cabins, silent forests, shadows moving between the trees when nobody should be there at all. And if you're brave enough to keep descending deeper into that darkness, then you need to watch 4 true and chilling cabin-in-the-woods horror stories that'll keep you up all night. Those stories are waiting for you right now on your screen, and trust me, they only get more disturbing from there. Before you leave, make sure to subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations for more true horror stories inspired by real encounters, unexplained events, and nightmares people wish they could forget. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, because the next story might be the one that stays with you long after the video ends. Until next time, keep your doors locked, keep your lights low, and whatever you hear outside tonight, don't answer it.